First up is, what do we mean by a real risk of significant harm, and how does it apply? According to PIPEDA, significant harm includes bodily harm, humiliation, damage to reputation or relationships, loss of employment, business or professional opportunities, financial loss, identity theft, negative effects on the credit record, and damage to or loss of property. So, how do you assess whether a breach of security safeguards creates a real risk of significant harm to one or multiple individuals? Your business should have a framework in place for assessing the real risk of significant harm. This will ensure that you assess all breaches the same way every time. Consider these two questions each time you assess a breach of security safeguards. Ask yourself, how sensitive is the personal information involved in the breach? How likely is it that the personal information has been or ever could be misused? Before we move on, let's look at some examples of what information is considered sensitive and how to determine the likelihood of it being misused. Some information is almost always considered sensitive. Things like medical records and financial records. Personal information that is commonly circulated, names and addresses for example, is not generally considered sensitive. However, any information can be sensitive depending on the context. For example, the names and addresses of subscribers to some special interest magazines might be considered sensitive. So, if a breach of security safeguards happens at your business, it's important to take into account what personal information has been breached and the situation or the impact that this breach has created or can create. This will help you determine whether the information is sensitive enough to create a real risk of significant harm to an individual. Once you consider the sensitivity of the information, you also need to assess whether the information might be misused. When you are determining if breached information is likely to be misused, it's best to take another close look at the circumstances of the breach. Here are a few of the questions to consider when determining the probability of misuse. What happened, and how likely is it that someone would be harmed by the breach? Who accessed or could have accessed the personal information? How long has the personal information been exposed? Has any misuse taken place? Is there evidence of malicious intent, as in the case of theft or hacking? Was the information exposed to entities, individuals, like information thieves, who are likely to attempt to cause harm or present a risk to the reputation of the affected individual or individuals? To recap, if there's a privacy breach at your business, the two guiding principles to help you assess whether it is a breach that creates a real risk of significant harm are: consider the sensitivity of the breached information, determine the likelihood of misuse. Okay, so let's say you've assessed that there's been a breach of your security safeguards, there is a real risk of significant harm, and you need to report it. What do you do?